Hello and welcome to everyone. My name is Errol Yabake and I'm the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Thanks especially to all the Chicago Council members for joining us today for a timely and important on-the-record conversation. So for all of my friends on the call, this will be on the record and widely available afterwards on global protest movements. We're calling this Twitter tear gas and the new global protest movements. By means of housekeeping, the Chicago Council is an independent and non-partisan platform. Views expressed by me and all the speakers here on this program are our own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. We're gonna go right into talking about this. We've got a really incredible lineup of panelists to help us think through some of these issues, but we will be getting to audience questions. So everyone, even now, can go to ccga.live in a web browser and submit questions online, and we will be getting to as many of those as possible. So like I said, we're here to talk about global protests. Last year, there were about political protests in about 114 countries around the world, and so in every region of the world. Activists are increasingly taking inspiration, tactics, and tools, including Twitter. You know, the title is alliterative, but you know, Twitter is certainly one of the tools that's being used. People are taking inspiration from one another around the world, and I think that's really interesting and also can be really exciting. My colleague Sam Brannon wrote something in the wake of the George Floyd protests here in the United States about how protests are moved broadly by what he calls broken and outdated modes of governance that perpetuate inequality, racial, socioeconomic, and otherwise. And I think I would love for our panelists to be thinking about and talking about that. And obviously, we're coming to you from our homes, or in my case, my office with the door closed, because of a global pandemic. And so I'm hoping that we can get to sort of how COVID-19 is exacerbating some of these existing inequalities. So without further ado, I'm really grateful to our great speakers. Nesreen Malik is a columnist for The Guardian, and she's author of the book, We Need New Stories, Challenging the Toxic Myths Behind Our Age of Discontent. She's a regular columnist and producing some really interesting stuff. Lucia Damert is a professor of international relations at La Universidad de Santiago de Chile, and she's a global fellow with the Latin America program at a really excellent think tank, the Woodrow Wilson Center. And lastly, Khaled Mansour is a senior fellow for human rights and humanitarian aid at the Arab Reform Initiative, and formerly served as the executive director of the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, a leading organization dedicated to advancing human rights in Egypt. But Khaled, you're not just an Egypt guy. You have experience in post-apartheid South Africa, Afghanistan, Iraq at the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003, Lebanon in 2006, and I'll just take a moment to acknowledge the tragedy in Beirut yesterday. Our thoughts and prayers go out to the families of the victims of that explosion yesterday. But Khaled, maybe I can just start with you. Thanks for being here. Would love to hear, when you hear about this conversation about global protests and global protest movements, how do you think about that? It can be Egypt, it can be within and amongst the countries, but are people taking inspiration from one another? And just sort of talk to us a little bit about how you think about that.
Thank you very much, Errol. I think, of course, people are taking inspiration at a tactical level. Some of the techniques they copy from each other. But the fact that you had 114 social protests around the world last year is just an indication of how similar the situation is around the world in the global south, like in Latin America, in Africa, in South Asia, but also for the disadvantaged communities like the Black or African American communities in the US. We have similarities in the rising inequality, we have similarities in the increasing poverty, we have similarities in deteriorating or unaffordable public services, from education to healthcare to housing. We have similarities in the disappearance of hope. People have become hopeless facing this global neoliberal system, if you like, of privatized services, of rising inequality, and of waiting for upward mobility that doesn't happen. So this is the similarity. That's why it's contagious in terms of tactics, because the internet is global. Certain tactics of how to avoid tear gas can be transferred from one country to another. But I think all of us were inspired by the same social and economic problems we are facing around the world.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I mean, if you look at the protests that we've had here in the United States, there's talk of systemic racism, which is obviously a big part of our society, unfortunately, and has been for a long time. And there's also a lot of the roots and sort of the economic inequality that we see here. Lucia, can I turn to you? And you're in Chile now. You've got lots of history throughout the region. Obviously, Chile itself had some very interesting protests, I think it was early last year. They were ostensibly education related, but would love to hear your thoughts, not only on Chile, but sort of broader about this inspiration question as well.
Sure, Al, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. This is a very nice panel to be at. And I fully agree with what Khaled said. It's not only global protest, but it's a global questioning regarding the neoliberal model. So the model is up for revision. And in some countries, that revision is, sparkling some contentious in the streets. There is also a new generation, and this generational change allows some people to go out to the public spaces. For many years, at least in Latin America, after dictatorships, after civil wars, people were afraid of going to the streets, and having a contestation against the police, a repressive police institution, actually. But nowadays, they are moving into the public spaces. They lost fear because they also lost hope. And that's an interesting relationship. Because young people in Latin America, they saw their parents and their grandparents working a lot, thinking that if you work, then you will be better off. And what they're seeing now, what they're perceiving now, is that economic fragmentation is huge. There is no social protection structures. COVID-19 will, hit hard, almost 3 decades backlash for the poor in Latin America. So those youngsters who are receiving a very poor quality education, even though they have the high school degree, that high school degree doesn't mean really anything. So they are open to discuss these issues on the public scene, on the public sphere. But on the other side, you have a very solid political elite that hasn't changed that much in perhaps 4 decades. It's almost the same people, rotating in the same seats. So that political elite is, instead of opening their, ears and arms and are starting to debate some issues, such as public spending on health, for instance. What they do is they just go to the police and send the police, as what's happening important in the US. So the police becomes like the face of the state. And that's one of the problems that we're facing, that the police is getting more and more delegitimized because of, repression. So throughout Latin America, protests, we always have protests on the street. But now I would say that, women rights, Aboriginal, indigenous people rights, those are structural issues that people are allowed to discuss now. And I think it's really important for the political elite to change. Otherwise, populism from the extreme right or the extreme left, will arise because, there is people eager to change, and the political elite is not translating that request into political changes.
Yeah, I was in Colombia in January, and there's some interesting stuff going on there related to what you were saying coming out of the peace process. But what was really interesting was the Afro-Colombianos. Those were demanding a new an increased voice, and when they weren't getting it, they were sort of setting up parallel systems. And I think anybody who's studied governance or sort of understands state legitimacy realizes that that's both inevitable but also problematic. I also love, Lucia, how you said, I mean, I don't love it in that it's sort of a tragic reflection of where people are, but you said, you know, people have lost fear because they've also lost hope. And I think as I'm thinking of threads throughout all of these movements, that that was really, really powerful as well. Nesrine, can I turn to you? You're currently in Cairo, if I remember that correctly, but you spend a lot of time in the UK and you think about transatlantic issues, you think about global issues. Also would love a 30-second plug on your book. I love the title. It's really interesting, challenging the toxic myths behind our age of discontent. So give viewers a little bit of a plug on the book, but then, you know, would love your general thoughts as we kick off this conversation.
Great, thank you. First of all, can you hear me? My internet connection is quite unstable. Great. Thank you for that great introduction. As you can tell, the book title is a bit of a mouthful when you introduced it in the beginning, but it is basically about all of this. It's about the structural inequalities, the sort of exceptionalism that exists in particularly Anglo-American society, that means when a pandemic is upon us, our healthcare systems collapse and our political processes fall apart, and we can't process that because we think we're so good at what we do. And so it's basically a study of the fundamental structures of exceptionalism that lull people into a false sense of security about the health of our democratic system, number one. Number two, about the state of equality that we have in terms of racial discrimination, etc. And the third thing is the sort of confidence that we put in our political leaders and our political processes. And America in particular is very susceptible to this sense that, you know, Trump is just an aberration and everything is great, and actually systems and processes will contain us. And I think the highest COVID-19 death toll in the world probably has something else to say about that. So basically, 30 seconds, that's what my book is about. And I have been writing a lot about the sort of intersection between COVID-19 casualties in the UK and the US and the Black Lives Matter movement. I feel like the two have a lot in common, and I feel, in fact, that Black Lives Matter would not have got as much traction as it did if there was not this sense that minorities were existing in a completely parallel universe vis-a-vis their health insurance, their access to healthcare, their living conditions, and their ability to shelter and not do risky work. And so what has become clear, particularly in the UK over the past 6 months, is that there are already huge existing infrastructural weaknesses in the way that the British state is built. And those infrastructural weaknesses have been developing, they have a short history over the past 10 years, which is the gutting of the state and what the right-wing Conservative Party called austerity. And a long history, which is generally the sort of weakening of public healthcare systems, weakening of social care systems, and the sort of centralization ideologically of the welfare state. So Britain went very much from left to center, left and right over the past 20, 30 years. And it's becoming clear that the ramifications of that do not just extend to people's access to immediate goods that they expected from the state. It also guts the state in a way that the most simple of challenges destabilize people's lives profoundly. So the removal of labor rights, for example, is a big thing. It's a big theme that we see in the US and the UK at the moment. So the fact that people have these 0-hour contracts, that essential workers that we have depended on over the past 6 months to deliver us our goods and our food and are male are the least paid and the least insured. These are things that we were not really attuned to until the pandemic happened. So I think the theme of the past 6 months, and then the theme of the summer, which has been Black Lives Matter since June, is that the way things have been structured are only paying dividends to a small number of people. And that sort of precarious stability can exist only in scenarios where there is no immediate threat. And to assume that kind of stability is going to be there all the time is completely wrong-headed. So if it's not a pandemic, it's a climate change disaster. If it's not a climate change disaster, it is an episode of political instability or volatility. And so our kind of liberal democracies that were predicated on the provision of access, the provision of goods to a consumerist individual, and that system then pays dividends to a small group of elite that are a sort of rentier elite, does not work unless everything is stable. And because we have seen instability over the past 6 months, that instability has exposed the fact that the majority of our polities, the majority of our population, has a very small distance between them and death, penury, eviction, unemployment, an extremely short distance. And the challenge over the next few months is how to resist the temptation to go back to how it was before and try and find a way to make that distance a lot bigger.
That's super interesting. I think if it weren't inappropriate for me to multitask while moderating, I think I would have already ordered your book, which I will do shortly. But I think that there's a lot there that you just talked about, and I think all three of you just talked about sort of diagnoses and why we're seeing these protest movements. I wanted to shift a little bit to what some of the goals are. And I think when I ask questions about goals of protests or goals of anything, people tend to really go tactical. And so I'm going to challenge all of us to think a little bit more on the strategic level about what changes are and can be. And I think tactics are fine as long as they sort of signal some sort of broader goals. I mean, Nasreen, you talked about how, Black Lives Matter and COVID-19 are intricately related. And in some ways, it not only spurred a stronger reaction, but sort of gave more power to those previously disenfranchised. I mean, we need people. We need those frontline workers in the health space, in the delivery space, at least here in the U.S. And I would imagine that's the case everywhere. But Khaled, can I come back to you on this sort of, when you think about these issues, what do you see as outcomes? And I think this gets a little bit into the COVID space as well. I've been reading more and more, and I've been thinking more and more about how reverting to some sort of previous mean is not actually what's going to happen after COVID-19. And so think about goals, but also tell us about, is there a new normal here?
I think it's a very legitimate question to ask, or question the outcome of the social protest, but it's a bit unfair. I mean, because what we are facing here, if you speak about racism, we're facing structures that have been laid down a few hundred years ago. And if you talk about the post-colonial state, I mean, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Sudan, whatever, I mean, these are systems that have been in place for 60 years. Systems that depoliticized the population, systems that were repressive, systems that have turned into almost kleptocracies. And you have mafiosos who have almost captured the state and its assets. So people are very clear in what they don't want. And it's legitimate to ask then what is the alternative? And I actually don't think people know exactly what is the alternative. And I think it's a bit early. I think what we need to ascertain now that people are very unhappy, and the options that were offered either by the sold out elites, either in America or in Egypt, is, okay, guys, let's make America great again. Let's restore the status quo ante. Or the populists who are saying probably the same thing, let's bring jobs back to America, but they're saying it in a different way. And both of them don't actually see the depth of the problem. The progressives, with a lack of a better word, or those who would like an alternative, are saying, no, It hasn't worked. It's not working. But they don't have a blueprint for where to go from here. And they don't have a blueprint because they are not facing to only conditions in America. So if you get rid of Trump, we are fine now. Or in Lebanon, they are facing very complex conditions. Let's take Lebanon for just a minute. I mean, this is a country that has been on a meltdown for a year. This is a country that had its economy crumbling to the extent that its lira or its currency has lost 80% of its value. This is a country which is facing corona, that had major social protests since October. And then you had a huge explosion yesterday in which like maybe 300 people were killed because this country, this government, which is fully corrupt, which is ruled by sectarianism, has left 3,000 tons of a highly explosive material in the port in the middle of the capital. Well, 3 tons of that material caused the Oklahoma bombing. So imagine what 3,000 tons can do. Totally negligent, totally irresponsible. And what they do, not a single official resigned. I mean, they call for a crisis cell. They call for, well, let's look at it. Let's look at what happened, as if they are not responsible. So the problems that these social protesters are facing are humongous. And no, they don't have a blueprint now, but I think it's very important to show that it's not working anymore, that we need a different system.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Lebanon, not just because of the tragic events of yesterday and the sort of lack of accountability. Lack of accountability in political leaders seems to be kind of the subtitle for Lebanon, it seems. I was there in November looking at stabilization. So this idea of sort of how do we prevent and come out of conflict. And I was talking to a protester, one of the sort of the grassroots leaders, and he said, stabilization. If stability means the maintenance of the status quo, this sort of confessional system in Lebanon, I don't want it. And I think he didn't necessarily, like you said, he didn't necessarily have a blueprint for what he did want, but it was very clear what he didn't want and what was broken. And so I would love for, maybe the next question after we get through this one is talking about sort of what are some of those blueprints and how can protest movements be connected to more and better governance? But Lucia, reflect on what Khalid said with regards to the Middle East, and is that your sense of what's going on in Latin America as well?
Yeah, I fully agree. And we in the Global South share a lot of very nice things, but also a lot of terrible legacies. And the fact that, we've been like in a pressure cooker for 4 decades already. And 80% of Latin Americans, were there working hard, thinking that, that's the way it is. And then they realize when the cooker is really hot and they cannot get health insurance, they cannot improve their work or their jobs, they realize that this system is really not working. So I would say that there are 2 issues that has to be taken into account. First, we should revisit the concept of citizenship, because nowadays most people do not vote. Most people are, far from political debates. They believe that, being customers is the way to move around society. So you are always bargaining stuff, bargaining your salary, bargaining your discount, bargaining everything, even your health insurance, and your education. So we have to move from customer, going back again to citizen. And citizen is a person who has voice, who is in action. It's not a passive person who just vote once every 4 or 6 years. And the second level is we have to revisit governance structure in our countries and perhaps in the world. This situation that Khalid actually describes is very similar as Guatemala, as many countries in Latin America that saw terrible human rights abuses and a lot of impunity. And some of the people who were basically linked to those human rights abuses are part of the political elite 4 decades later. So I understand the anger. I understand the rage, because this is people who are being considered criminals. So they're facing the police and most of the time prison. But on the other side, they're working really hard. And my main concern is that these are two huge structural changes that has to be taken in, into account. And also global protests, but protests in Latin America lack leadership, like a person, a leader, and lack organization. So these loose movements, they face huge challenges, but I don't know if they will be able to, get into a more consolidated movement that will, make proposals for changes, or actually this is going to be like a decade of turbulence in terms of conflict and violence, and moving forward from one place to the other, reconfiguring citizenship and governance. And that's my sense in Latin America, throughout Latin America, even countries that were considered part of the OECD, like Chile or Mexico. We have this euphemism of the middle class. In fact, middle class were poor people with access to credit cards. And we just realized that with COVID-19. But if you go 6 months ago and read all papers regarding Chile, the success of Chile was based on, the openness of the middle class. But what do we talk about when we talk about middle class? And that's a good question to start, debating.
I think those are really, really important points. Nasreen, you in July wrote an article entitled, you have this really amazing column, which I recommend to everybody, but you wrote something in early July that says, it seems Black Lives Matter don't matter quite so much now that we've gotten to the hard bit. And I think it goes a little bit to this question of goals and sort of, how do you turn the sort of real disgruntled sense of that we've been talking about, and sort of not blaming people obviously for being in the street, this idea that Lucia talked about sort of fear going away at the same time that hope goes away. I mean, all of these tend to be kind of responses, but how should we be thinking about the goals of the protest movements to the extent that they exist? I know BLM in the US certainly has some very stated, clear goals, but how do we think about that, especially as you point out in your July article, when the going gets tough?
That's a very good question. And what I wrote about in the article and what I touch upon quite a lot in the book is this idea that demanding very specific paths to change from resistance movements is a way of chilling those movements, actually. So we have to be careful.
Interesting.
When these questions are asked. I mean, you were asking it in a kind of very good faith exploratory way, but structurally, there are ways to frame these movements as unrealistic and incoherent and immature and idealistic. And actually, the most important thing is that these, as far as I'm concerned, is that these protest movements normalize protest, that they normalize the fact that the status quo is not acceptable. That is the purpose of a protest movement. And all protest movements throughout history are incoherent and spontaneous and organic and rudderless, and we only give them this imprimatur of coherence in hindsight as a matter of history. And we also elevate their leaders, who are quite controversial people at the time, to saintlyhood, around whom there was consensus, and there absolutely was not. Martin Luther King is a very good example, where people are kind of using him now to shame Black Lives Matter protesters into peaceful means. And at the time, he was not well loved by white liberals. And so we need to think broadly when, I mean, Lucia said what we talk about when we talk about the middle class is a good question to ask. And I think what we talk about when we talk about goals is also a question that we should be interrogating, because it's okay for a movement not to have specific goals. It's okay for a movement to have goals that seem unfeasible. It's okay for a movement to have no idea what it wants, for it just to channel anger and frustration. The utter establishment consensus, especially across the West, is so entrenched that even shaking it, even challenging it at all, is a huge success, a huge win. As far as I know, I've just finished writing a US version of the book, and the conclusion to that book has been written post Black Lives Matter in the summer, and is a far more hopeful when you actually sit down and survey what has happened over the past 8 weeks because of Black Lives Matter. It's been huge. I mean, I never thought there would be a discussion about the history of colonialism in the UK. I never thought there would be a discussion about Confederate statues and the kind of the super quick education people have had over the past 8 weeks or so in the history of slavery in America. And there are indications as well that attitudes are shifting dramatically in a subterranean manner. And so there was a survey, I think, by Vice a couple of months ago that showed that the softening or the attitude of white left-wing voters towards Black Lives Matter or towards racial equality in general improved over the 2 weeks after the Black Lives Matter movement by the same quantum as it had over the past 10 years. And so things are happening very, very quickly underground. And the way that then manifests in local elections, in national elections, in how people practice their own politics on a personal level, within their families, in their workplaces, is inestimable, I think, at the moment. And so the answer to your question is both negative and positive. It's negative in the sense that I don't know. Like, I don't know what's going to happen. There are very loose demands globally. There are some very specific demands in the US in particular that are seen as unrealistic. But the positive side is even rudderless, even leaderless, this global movement has huge coherence, stunning coherence across borders. And that coherence is a revision of our historical exceptionalism, like basically a rejection of a very confected, fabricated view of history. The second very coherent message that is being sent out is that there is brutality that is enacted by the state against people of color and against people of color of certain classes in particular. And the third thing that I'm hearing very clearly is that there is a young generation that is very confident and empowered in ways that people of my generation were not. And their understanding of what is acceptable is very different. And I think they're about to change the calculus in ways that we are going to be quite bewildered by over the next few months.
We're starting to get a bunch of questions, and some of those are related to youth. So I want to come back to this question. But before we move on, Khaled and Lucia, Nesrine put some really interesting things on the table there, especially about sort of the goal of these protests doesn't need to be that there is a goal. I mean, those of us who sit in this kind of, research, ivory tower, whatever you want to call it, we need structure. We need, reason and in order to a certain extent. And some of that comes sort of ex ante, but maybe, a good goal is like Nesrine said, I think very eloquently, that we just normalize the existence of protests in what Lucia called maybe a decade of discontent. So Khaled, what are your thoughts on that?
I definitely agree with Nesrine that we have to legitimize anger. I mean, it's our right to be angry at what has been happening for decades or for centuries, like in the case of Black Americans. But it's not that we are totally devoid of concrete ideas and done in good faith. It just like once you start talking about them, you are being dismissed, as Nesrine said and as Lucia alluded to, start being dismissed as too idealistic. Like when we speak about taxation systems, when we speak about an end to tax havens, when we speak about the fact that Google and companies like Amazon can shop around the world for the cheapest place to go, when we speak about moving all the apparel industries to Bangladesh because there you don't have labor rights, and we say, no, you gotta have labor rights internationally. But these are ideas. These are suggestions. The problem is that once you start talking about them, you talk about the fundamentals of the existing systems. And the international complicity that put down the social protest in the Middle East didn't only come from the Middle East and North Africa. It came from Europe, it came from the US, it came from people who are much more interested in counter-migration, in counter-terrorism. It came from people in Paris and in Berlin who cooperate with militias in Libya to stop African migrants and put them in militia prisons in Libya so that they don't cross the Mediterranean. So if you want us to speak concretely about ideas, let's fix the global migration system. No, there are ideas. There are actually many ideas, and there are many people who have been working on these suggestions for a long time. It's just we don't have a discussion, and we are not invited to the table. So the protest and the anger is simply to tell the CEOs, the politicians, the arms manufacturers that we have things to say, we are not happy with this, and we want a place at the table, or there will be no table.
Yeah, I think that's really an excellent point, and it just sort of makes me think that we've been talking about, you know, these protest movements about individual countries, and I think, Khalid, you painted this sort of, this is not just about individual countries, this is about countries having impacts on other countries and other regions as well, and that goes in both ways. So thank you for taking an already complicated picture and further complicating it. But I think that's really a really critical point. Lucia, would love to bring you in on this, and then I do want to get to some of these audience questions that are already coming in. So Lucia?
Sure, yeah, I agree with my colleagues here, and I love the idea that Nesrin said about, you know, the lack of coherence. Of course, you know, for the establishment, for those who think that they are running the game, because this is the fact that there is people that think that they're running the game and there is others playing, yeah, you know, and the role of the other is just to play, is not to make decisions, is not to put some issues on the table, because the table belongs to some people, and the fact that those people are in, you know, in Davos, and you see all these discussions, you know, about your future so far away, being placed, you know, in places that are just foreign to you. And I think that that opens for anger, and that opens for frustration. But there is also an expectation problem, because for many decades, we've told people that they have rights, but in fact, they don't. And my parents, and perhaps even myself, we kind of, you know, get used to it and try to work on the margins. But nowadays, young people are required and protesting for more rights. And I think that the first right we have to talk about is the right to protest, is the right to be on the street, is the right to be, you know, generally unhappy about the system. However, in Latin America, we had that process for a long time, and political elites were really successful in putting those movements aside and consolidating, you know, political and economic power in very few hands. So my perception is that there are proposals, in some cases are not as structural as some people said, you know, like bringing the Aboriginal people into political places, quotas for women participation. I mean, we're talking about really specific issues. But the fact of the matter is that every time we, you know, make one step forward, a couple of months later, we go back. And I think that this situation that we are seeing is pretty much linked to the climate change debate. Before the COVID-19, you remember we were talking about, you know, this war going basically to end, and many people saying, well, we cannot stop, you know, flights, we cannot stop the industries, otherwise the world is not going to grow economically. Now we are, you know, with so much changes, and the world didn't die, and we are facing a lot of economic crisis, but I'm pretty sure that, you know, people like us, I've been in my house for 5 months already, we are taking a personal and societal introspection. to see if our actions are linked to the type of society we really wanted to build. So I'm pretty sure that after COVID, there will be more people on the street requesting changes than less.
Yeah, I think that's what I want to end the conversation with, Lucia and Nesrine and Khaled. I would love for you, I want to get to some audience questions, and then maybe my last question to you, so you can start thinking about it, is kind of how does COVID change all of this? And I think Lucia really touched on some of this, but would love kind of your parting thoughts on where we're going, whether it's when there's a widely available vaccine or just sort of whenever we hopefully come out of this. And Lucia, it's worth mentioning, I mean, we're all lucky enough to have internet connections that are strong enough and be sort of in our homes. My home doesn't currently have air conditioning, which is why I'm in the office, but hopefully that'll get fixed very soon and I can go back home. But that in and of itself is an extreme privilege that all of us enjoy, and many of the people that we're talking about that are in the streets don't have that same privilege, or are fighting for people that don't have that same privilege, as Nesrine mentioned before. So somebody mentioned youth before, and there's an audience question about student-driven movements that have led to significant reform and changes in many countries and contexts. So how central is specifically youth activism and agency of young people in the protest movements? So Nesrine, can I pose that question to you first, and then Khaled and Lucia would love your thoughts on that as well.
Well, so I think the most relevant is the Black Lives Matter movement. The demographics of that have been stunning. In that, when I pride myself on being one of the younger columnists in The Guardian, but I felt aged, let me tell you, when I spoke to Black Lives Matter protesters in the UK, because they were teenagers, they were in school, let alone university or college. And it made me, what became clear, it made me realize that there is an entire generation that grew up enabled, that grew up, even if they were disenfranchised, they felt like they were part of a conversation because they found each other. There were ways that they could find each other on social media, on apps, through their phones. So they, no matter how disenfranchised or alienated or unnetworked they are in the realm of power, they had a spontaneous, grassroots, ready-made network between each other by the time they were ready to mobilize. And I think that is phenomenally powerful, and that I don't think people in charge realize the power of that. And one thing that we would do well to heed is to see the speed and spread of Black Lives Matter protests all over the world, which I felt oddly people didn't really focus on. I think it was only the New York Times that really summarized this and gave it its due. It was basically the largest global movement in our lifetime. There were Black Lives Matter protesters using the same language and the same slogans all over the world. And where it was not about race, it became about something else. It became the sort of anti-establishment protest movement. And it had its own soundtrack, it had its own imagery, it had its own videos, and there was this whole universe of communication around it that I think people of a certain age just don't understand. So I think that there is the kind of the pain and the effort and the high friction business of creating activist networks in the past is gone. I think it's actually much easier to do that now. However, a note of caution on the optimism of youth, and I think we saw this, and Khaled will be able to weigh in on this, I think, better. We saw this in the Arab Spring, and I saw this in Sudan personally last year, as we had this huge revolution in Sudan, led by people who were born after the President Omar al-Bashir came to power. So they knew nothing else. They were in their 20s mostly. And even though they managed to overthrow this corrupt ICC indicted president, the networks of power are as powerful and as embedded and as entrenched as any promise of youth that can threaten them. And so I think that there is a huge energy there. There is a lot of ways for that energy to be expressed, but there is also an incredibly entrenched, powerful, corrupt, networked, incestuous politics and media world that knows all the techniques to disempower that movement. And so what needs to happen is there needs to be a bridge between that and power. And that bridge is what we're trying to figure out at the moment. And so, yeah, I just want to end on that note of caution and not to get carried away, because we have seen these youth movements, especially with social media in the Arab Spring. Everyone just thought it was done. Social media, that was it. Social media was going to connect people over the world, was going to overthrow corrupt systems. But there is a big potential for authoritarianism redux. And just very briefly, before I pass on to Khaled, on your question about what happens after COVID, there is also this risk, there is also this threat that as economies start to suffer, as people begin to fight over resources, that it becomes an even more brutal, more capitalistic, and more resource maximizing, exploitative culture that we live in, as opposed to going in the other direction. So the work needs to be done now to prevent that sort of land grab as things become more difficult after the pandemic.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And you touched on it, another question that was asked about the role of social media and what it's played. So Khaled, you were called out by Nesrine several times there, but sort of talk to us about the youth activism piece and the degree to which you want to talk about how social media has been part of that conversation. That'd be great.
I think, as Nasreen said, I think the youth role is extremely important, but it's somewhat exaggerated. It's extremely important because this has been the case in history. I mean, we don't have many revolutions that are started by the old. Revolutions usually happen against entrenched interests, and these usually accrue to people who are older in age in general, but from a certain class and background. The youth bring a lot of energy and new tactics to a revolutionary struggle or to a social protest. I mean, at the end of the day, when I am in Tahrir Square, I will not be in the front row throwing stones. I will be back because I will be a burden on them because I'm slow, I'm older, I'm 50. They also bring with them the ability not to buy into the old stuff. So increasingly, they don't buy into Islamism or Islamic groups. Increasingly, they don't buy into nationalism. We, the Arabs, Israel is the only enemy. They don't buy into that stuff. So they are a threat because all these entrenched interests don't only work with money. They also work with ideas to convince people that you are Arabs or Egyptians, so you have to do this or do that, and you have to be patient until we are done with the other more important projects. But I caution a little bit because also youth belong to different classes. Youth can be white, youth can be black, youth can be men, youth can be women. So youth also have their own interests. And the problem starts usually when you move from let's bring down that regime to let's build an alternative, because then various interests will come into play. And on social media, not only youth can use social media, as we have seen in the Middle East and North Africa in the past 10 years, that yes, social media provided a way for people to interconnect, to organize better, and to look at alternatives in other countries. But also then we have seen how governments or the elite have come back with vengeance from blocking websites. Like we have 500 websites blocked in Egypt, meaning VPN is illegal in the United Arab Emirates, surveillance systems that are produced in America and bought in a massive buy by the Saudis. You have very, very elastic rules. I mean, Trump would like to close down TikTok. In Egypt, in the last 2 weeks, 9 women were arrested and 3 of them sentenced for using TikTok as a platform because they are violating family values. Many people are in prison because of Facebook posts and tweets. So social media is a sword with 2 edges, if you like.
Yeah, and thanks for pointing out those two are not synonymous. I didn't mean to insinuate that they were, but I think that that's all really excellent. Lucia, I'm going to turn to you shortly on this youth one. After that, I'm going to try to rapid fire get through some of these other questions, and so I'll pose a question to one of you, and if there's sort of short interjections from the others, we'll do that. But Khaled, one of the questions is actually related to government responses, and so we'll come back to you on that one. But Lucia, before we do that, talk to us about youth.
Well, I agree with my colleagues. I think that the youth has brought a new narrative. Instead of, for instance, in Latin America, instead of talking about women's rights, youth are talking about feminism, and they are not ashamed of, or instead of talking about, general identity issues, they're talking about lesbians, transsexuals. So there is a culture of a new words being used, and challenge the political elite using euphemism all the time to really put some issues on the table. And I think that, of course, with climate change, they did that. I agree with Khalid. Then what's the question about, building stuff? But I'm pretty sure that each generation has its own, challenges, and they will be able to do something. But at the present time, students and youth in general, what they're doing is they're fighting. They are in the provocateur type of work, bringing stuff, bringing issues to the table. And for at least in Latin America, social media, it's also a double-edged sword. We have, increasing number of people believing on fake news, on authoritarian topics, racial issues that were never publicly discussed because they were, comments that are discriminatory. Xenophobia is increasing. So you have like these bubbles, you have the positive bubble of the social media when everyone is like discussing issues like a public sphere, and then you have this awful bubble of hatred, of discrimination and racism. And in that bubble, I'm pretty sure that there's other people working towards a more authoritarian regime, and how to build, a lead that will close protests in general. So in my sense is that the youth, and this is my last point regarding this issue, the youth has been able to build bridges to older people. It's not only the youth on the streets. At least in Chile, the youth started it, but then we have 1.2 million people on the street, and many people from my generation and older. They realize that, being customers will not get us to any good society. So we went to the streets, and we used that energy towards building a more, consensual sense that a change for my generation, a revolution for younger generations is needed.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Khaled, I want to come back to you because we've talked about authoritarianism several times, not to insinuate that you have authoritarian tendencies, but there are leaders that certainly do have authoritarian tendencies when they're responding to these things. And so the question is, in the long run, are these protests likely to lead to social progress or repression? And how do protesters think about avoiding the latter?
I don't know. I think by definition, if you have a massive social protest, that people have been sort of confused that it doesn't have an organized hierarchy, it's very difficult to produce a great leader that can save the nation. Most of these social protests in the Middle East and North Africa, at least, and the little I know about the others, do not produce big leaders or authoritarian structures, with certain exceptions, like the militias in the US, if you like, or like Islamists in the Middle East and North Africa. But most of the rest suffer from, and I say suffer advisedly, suffer sometimes from the lack of any hierarchy, that they are too horizontal sometimes. So they spend a lot of time trying to agree in a very democratic way, like the Occupy movement did in New York, for example, that I saw myself, trying to reach a decision, which is great for inculcating democratic practices, but it takes time. I don't see any tendencies to produce an authoritarian alternative to an existing authoritarian one, but I just cannot predict what will be the outcome.
Yeah. Nasreen, I would love your thoughts on this, sort of how to avoid or how to get around or how to prevent the sort of knee-jerk authoritarian reactions that we're seeing across the world. But there's another question here that I also wanted to put to you. It's a fascinating question. It says, do protests require violent expressions, for example, looting, for people to take notice? So would love your thoughts on either of those.
That is a great question. And it's also one of the things I talk about in the book, which is how protest movements are always expected to be very polite and to be these sort of humble petitions to power.
Colin Kaepernick tried that with bending a knee, right? I think that the question needs to be reversed, which is instead of, do protest movements need to have a violent element for people to pay attention to them? I think the question is, do protest movements need to have any particular component at all to make them successful? They don't. They just do what they do. Like, protest movements by their nature are spontaneous and the result of other processes breaking down. Protests are the continuation of politics by other means, when the means that we have for solving our issues are either blocked by political interests or don't work. So I'm extremely indulgent of protests. I just think they will do what they need to do. Like, they are just a function of what happened before them. And if what happened before them was extremely repressive, extremely restrictive, extremely divisive, then protests will express that in their own way. And I think we fixate far too much. Pardon me, I think that's me. That's all right. The other thing, Nasreen, that I wanted to point out there is that the protesters are oftentimes not the ones who are looting, at least here in the United States. My understanding is there needs to be some differentiation of those groups.
Yes, and I think that we also conveniently, we try and find ways of smearing protests by their most extreme manifestations.
Right.
And we expect them also to police themselves very well. So we expect this spontaneous organic movement to know which elements in it are sinister and kick them out. We expect it to control every single individual, and we also expect it to rein in the enthusiasm of its allies. It's completely unrealistic. But it's an incredibly effective tactic. I urge people, whenever these conversations happen, to realize where they're coming from, right? They're coming from a place of delegitimizing the protest and casting doubt on its intentions and its methods. Sure. Sorry, go ahead.
Just to point out that there is lots of literature in the criminological arena that shows that escalation of violence during protest is much related to police violence than protester violence throughout the world.
Yeah, it's a really excellent point, and I'm starting to think that we should have about 4 hours for this conversation. So, Khaled, I know that you wanted to say something, and so perhaps last sort of 15-second word to you, and then I'll close our unfortunately short time together.
I know it's not great not to have disagreement on a panel, but I'm sorry, I have to agree again with both Nasreen and Lucia. Can you please look at the collateral damage of the war on terror in the last 20 years? And I can assure you it's 1,000 times at least much more devastating and lethal than the unintentional collateral damage caused by social protests by people who have lost loved ones because they couldn't treat them, who became ignorant because they couldn't go to school, who became unemployed because they don't have the skills. So let's just put things into context. Yes, they have burned some property, and that's awful for people who own them. But in context, the collateral damage of social protest is far much less than the wreckage wreaked by states over the last 20 years in the war on terror, for example.
Which I think is exactly why we're having this conversation. So I can't think of a better way to end this. Thanks, Nasreen, Lucia, Khalid, you were amazing. I wish we could have continued this for longer. For the audience, Aislinn Pulley from Black Lives Matter Chicago was supposed to join today's program, but unfortunately at the last minute wasn't able to participate. I'm being asked to say that the council hopes to host Black Lives Matter in future conversations on the issues driving the global protest movement. So that seems to be an open offer from the Chicago Council. But listen, thanks to all three of you, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. There were excellent questions and audience engagement. So it was an honor to be here, and thanks again to the panelists.